There's a quiet power in the way stone can hold a story, centuries of knowledge, faith, and culture, etched not in ink, but in the very bones of a building. Picture standing in the shadow of a medieval monastery, where the air itself feels heavy with unspoken wisdom. These aren't just ruins, they're silent guardians of entire worlds, designed to preserve what words alone could not. Across Europe, from the misty hills of Ireland to the sunlit cloisters of France, architects and monks crafted spaces that spoke through stillness, light, and form. This is the architecture of silence, a language without letters, where every archway, every shadow, every carefully placed window was a deliberate act of preservation. Think about the last time you walked into a place that made you lower your voice without thinking: a library, a cathedral, maybe even an old family home. There's something about certain spaces that commands reverence, as if the walls themselves are listening. Now imagine that feeling amplified across centuries, where entire societies entrusted their most sacred truths not to parchment, but to the very structures they lived and prayed within. These buildings weren't just shelters, they were living manuscripts, their layouts and symbols encoding everything from religious teachings to agricultural cycles. The monks who inhabited them understood something profound. That silence could be a vessel, a way to protect their culture from the chaos of wars, invasions, and the slow erosion of time. So how did they do it? How did a culture with no printing press, no digital backups, ensure its survival through architecture alone? The answer lies in the deliberate genius of medieval design. The way a cloister's garden mirrored the order of the cosmos, or how a scriptorium's placement ensured just enough light to illuminate manuscripts but not enough to fade them. Over the next minutes, we'll step inside these spaces, unraveling the hidden language of stone and shadow. You'll see how a single abbey could hold the collective memory of a people, and why, even today, these silent structures still have so much to teach us about resilience, creativity, and the art of remembering. This isn't just a story about the past. It's a reminder that sometimes the loudest messages are the ones never spoken aloud. Let's begin. Silent architecture speaks through absence, through the deliberate spaces between stones, the play of light and shadow, the way a vaulted ceiling pulls your gaze upward as if toward heaven itself. It's a language of implication where meaning isn't shouted but whispered through design. Take the humble cloister, for example, a square garden bordered by covered walkways found in nearly every medieval monastery. At first glance, it's just a peaceful place to stroll, but every detail carries intention. The four sides mirror the four rivers of Eden, a reminder of paradise lost and hoped for. The central garden, often planted with medicinal herbs, becomes a living library of healing knowledge. Even the rhythm of the columns repeating yet never identical echoes the monastic belief in harmony amid individuality. This wasn't accidental artistry. Medieval builders worked like theologians with chisels, embedding layers of symbolism into every decision. A church's east-facing altar didn't just catch the morning light, it aligned with the rising sun, a daily metaphor for resurrection. The thickness of a wall or the curve of an arch could reflect mathematical principles borrowed from ancient texts, turning geometry into a form of prayer. And in places like Ireland's Skellig Michael or Greece's Meteora, where monasteries clung to cliffsides, the very isolation of the buildings shouted defiance against oblivion. These weren't just remote locations, they were declarations that some truths are too precious to risk losing to invaders or time. What's astonishing is how universal this silent language became. A pilgrim from Germany could walk into a Spanish abbey and understand its sacred logic, not because they shared a spoken tongue, but because the architecture itself was a shared vocabulary. The rounded arches of Romanesque chapels spoke of strength and shelter, while the soaring heights of later Gothic cathedrals turned stone into lace, whispering of transcendence. Even the labyrinthine layouts of some monastic libraries, where books were chained to desks in a precise order, acted as three-dimensional encyclopedias, knowledge you could walk through, touch, and experience bodily. This is where monastic communities became more than builders. They were curators of collective memory. In an age when literacy was rare and books were precious, these silent structures became the backup drives of their era. A single cathedral could encode everything from liturgical calendars to astronomical charts in its stained glass and sculptures. The Benedictines, Cistercians, and other orders didn't just preserve texts. They built environments that taught without words, where every corner held a lesson in theology, history, or survival. To step into these spaces was to be schooled by the walls themselves, a curriculum written in stone, light, and silence. Monastic life revolved around rhythms of silence so profound that architecture became its echo. Walk through the arched doorway of any medieval abbey, and you'd immediately feel the weight of intentional design, a world calibrated to turn physical space into spiritual discipline. The rule of Saint Benedict didn't just suggest quiet, it wove silence into the very fabric of daily life, and the buildings followed suit. Cloisters weren't merely walkways but tools for meditation, their covered passages encouraging slow, deliberate movement. Refectories, where monks ate in wordless communion, were often placed near kitchens not for convenience, but so the scent of bread and herbs would anchor the mind in gratitude rather than chatter. Even the dormitories, with their rows of simple beds, were arranged to minimize distraction, each sleeper facing the same direction, a physical reminder of unity. This wasn't austerity for its own sake. Every architectural choice served a dual purpose: to shield sacred knowledge from the noise of the outside world, and to train the mind in the art of deep attention. Take the Scriptorium, the heart of a monastery's intellectual life. Tucked away from bustling courtyards, its windows were carefully angled to maximize daylight without glare, protecting both eyesight and parchment. Here, monks copied texts not just with ink, but with their bodies, sitting in postures that blended endurance with reverence, their desks tilted to keep pages in shadow. The room itself was a kind of silent teacher, its very layout insisting that preservation required patience, and it worked. While wars raged beyond monastery walls, these scriptoria safeguarded everything from Virgil's poetry to Galen's medical treatises, ensuring ideas survived even when empires fell. But the genius of monastic silence went deeper than protecting manuscripts. It encoded living knowledge into ritual and space. Consider the labyrinthine herb gardens found in abbeys like St. Gall in Switzerland. Each plant was placed according to its use: medicinals near the infirmary, culinary herbs by the kitchen, creating a map of healing wisdom that could be read by anyone, literate or not. The cloister's central fountain wasn't just decorative. Its sound masked whispers, preserving the quiet while its water mirrored the purity of contemplation. Even the abbey's bells followed a mathematical rhythm, their peals dividing the day into segments for prayer, labor, and study, a sonic architecture that disciplined time itself. What's remarkable is how these silent practices preserved not just texts but entire ways of being. Gregorian chant, for instance, was more than music. It was a mnemonic device, its rising and falling melodies helping monks memorize scriptures word for word. The abbey's very floor plans often mirrored celestial patterns, aligning feast days with sunlight streaming through specific windows at solstices. This wasn't mysticism, it was precision engineering for cultural survival. When Viking raids or political upheavals threatened Europe's fragile knowledge, monasteries stood as silent arcs, their walls holding more than stones. They carried the heartbeat of a civilization that understood. Some truths are too vital to be left to words alone, and perhaps that's their lasting lesson. In a world drowning in noise, these medieval architects and monks mastered the art of listening, to the spaces between notes, to the meanings baked into brick and mortar. They knew that real preservation isn't just about storing information, but about creating ecosystems where wisdom can breathe. Their legacy whispers to us still that sometimes the surest way to save a culture is to build sanctuaries where silence can speak. Step into the Scriptorium, and you step into a sanctuary of stillness, a room so carefully crafted for concentration that even the air feels heavy with purpose. These were not just workspaces but temples of transcription, where every architectural choice served the sacred task of preservation. The windows, narrow and high, angled daylight to fall perfectly across desks without casting shadows on parchment. Thick stone walls muffled the outside world, while the very layout, often tucked between chapel and library, ensured that scribes worked in a bubble of quiet, surrounded by the texts they copied and the faith that drove them. Here, silence was more than a rule, it was the raw material of scholarship. Monks bent over vellum for hours, their quills scratching in rhythms so practiced they became a kind of meditation. No chatter, no interruptions, just the slow, deliberate dance of ink across page. And yet, this silence wasn't empty. It thrummed with intention. Each stroke of the pen was an act of devotion, a belief that by copying Aristotle or Augustine, they were stitching wisdom into the fabric of time. Mistakes were rare, not just because of discipline, but because the room itself seemed to demand perfection. The Scriptorium's architecture, its light, its isolation, even its temperature, was calibrated to keep minds sharp and hands steady. Look closer at those illuminated manuscripts, and you'll see how silence took visual form. The vibrant colors and gold leaf weren't mere decoration. They were echoes of the divine, turning letters into tiny monuments. A capital D might bloom with vines and beasts, not to distract but to deepen the text's meaning. These were silent sermons in pigment, where artistry and theology fused. And because most people couldn't read, these images did something extraordinary. They made the sacred legible to everyone. A peasant might not understand Latin, but they could hear the story of creation in the swirls of an illuminated Bible. But the real magic of the Scriptorium lay in its alchemy of solitude and community. Though each monk worked in silence, they were part of an unbroken chain copying texts that had been copied for centuries, adding their hands to a lineage of preservation. When a scribe finished a page, they weren't just producing a book, they were building a bridge across time. And because every monastery's scriptorium followed similar designs from Ireland to Italy, this silent system became a network. A text copied in a Burgundian abbey might find its way to a Spanish library, then to a scholar's hands in Oxford. The walls were local, but the mission was universal, to keep knowledge alive, one careful letter at a time. This quiet labor didn't just save ancient texts, it shaped them. Scribes weren't human photocopiers. They corrected errors, added marginal notes, sometimes even updated older works with contemporary insights. In this way, the Scriptorium was more than a preservation hub. It was a living dialogue with the past. And when you consider that many classical texts survive today only because of these medieval copies, the weight of their silent work takes your breath away. Imagine Aristotle's logic or Virgil's poetry lost to decay, if not for a chain of monks who saw their labor as sacred. Now, follow the path those manuscripts took after leaving the scribe's desk just a few steps away into the library. If the Scriptorium was the beating heart of monastic knowledge, the library was its memory. Here, books weren't just stored, they were organized with a precision that would make modern librarians nod in respect. Chained to desks or shelved according to elaborate systems, these volumes turned quiet rooms into landscapes of thought. And because every book was handwritten, each was a unique artifact, its margins sometimes holding secrets, doodles, prayers, even complaints from scribes. The ink is thin, the parchment rough, and the day long. What's striking is how these spaces married silence with accessibility. Unlike today's hushed libraries, medieval monastic libraries were often places of quiet study, where monks could consult texts right there, tracing fingers over words copied by their brothers. The books couldn't leave, but their ideas could, carried in minds trained to memorize. This was knowledge held in trust, protected by architecture, but meant to be lived. And in an age when books were precious enough to be listed in wills alongside land and jewels, these libraries weren't just rooms, they were fortresses of the mind where silence stood guard over the future. The library at St. Gall wasn't just a room, it was a cosmos in miniature. Step inside and you'd feel it immediately. The way the shelves radiated outward from a central point like spokes on a wheel, with the most sacred texts, Bibles, liturgical books, positioned closest to the heart of the room. This wasn't arbitrary. Every inch of space whispered a philosophy. That knowledge had an order, a sacred geometry mirroring the universe itself. The builders of these libraries understood something profound, that to protect ideas, you had to give them a home that honored their weight. Thick walls of local stone buffered against dampness and decay, while narrow windows filtered light to a gentle glow, strong enough to read by but too weak to fade ink. Even the placement of desks mattered, angled to catch the sun's arc without exposing parchment to its harshest rays. But the real marvel was how these silent spaces fostered a particular kind of scholarship. Unlike today's libraries, where rustling pages and tapping keyboards fill the air, medieval libraries thrived on a hushed intensity. Scholars didn't just read, they absorbed, often mouthing words silently as their fingers traced lines of text. This wasn't merely about concentration, it was a form of reverence. Books were rare, precious, sometimes even chained to their stands, not to restrict access but to ensure their survival. Each volume had survived fires, wars, and the slow gnaw of time. Handling it was a sacred act, and because many monks memorized large portions of texts, libraries became more than storage. They were seed banks where ideas could be replanted in human minds and carried beyond the walls. Now look beyond the bookshelves to the walls themselves. Here, sacred geometry took physical form. The arches above doorways weren't just structural, their curves echoed the vault of heaven. Columns were spaced according to harmonic ratios, their proportions pulled from ancient mathematical treatises like Pythagoras' theories on musical intervals. Even the floor tiles often held hidden patterns, interlocking circles symbolizing eternity, or labyrinths inviting contemplative walks. These weren't decorations, they were mnemonics, visual cues that helped anchor abstract concepts in stone. A monk pacing the library didn't just pass through empty space, he moved through a living diagram of cosmic order. Consider the Cistercian abbeys where austerity met precision. Their libraries avoided elaborate carvings or stained glass, not from lack of skill, but because every element served a purpose. Whitewashed walls amplified scarce light. Bare floors carried sound differently, making whispered conversations carry farther, a subtle cue to maintain silence. Even the scent of the space was engineered. cedar shelves repelled insects, while bundles of lavender tucked between volumes kept mold at bay. Every sensory detail was calibrated to create an environment where focus came effortlessly, where the mind could slip into deep engagement with the past. This interplay of geometry and silence reached its peak in the great cathedral libraries like Canterbury's or Chartres. Here, the building itself became a kind of encyclopedia. Pillars carved with figures of prophets and saints turned architecture into theology. Stained glass windows filtered sunlight into jewel-toned lessons, their colors shifting with the hours to mark the passage of both time and truth. And beneath it all, the labyrinth, a winding path inlaid in the floor, often leading to the library's entrance. Walking it wasn't just a physical journey, it was a ritual of preparation, a way to shed the noise of the world before entering the realm of silent study. What's astonishing is how these designs transcended borders. From the misty highlands of Scotland to the sun-baked cloisters of Sicily, medieval libraries shared a visual language. A scholar from Poland could step into a Portuguese scriptorium and recognize the same sacred ratios in the arches, the same intentionality in the play of light. This wasn't coincidence, it was a networked system of preservation, a silent conspiracy against oblivion, and it worked. While empires rose and fell outside their walls, these libraries safeguarded not just books, but ways of thinking. They stood as proof that culture could be etched into something as immutable as stone, and that silence, when shaped by geometry, could speak across centuries. Sacred geometry wasn't just about measurements, it was a medieval form of poetry, where circles and squares became verses in stone. Walk into Chartres Cathedral, and you're stepping inside a mathematical hymn. The floor plan isn't just functional, it's a mandala with the nave forming a perfect cross aligned to the cardinal directions. Every column's height relates to its width by the golden ratio, a proportion so harmonious it appears in seashells and galaxies. Even the labyrinth inlaid in the floor isn't a maze but a meditation path, its 11 concentric circles mirroring the orbits of celestial bodies. This wasn't architecture for the eyes alone, it was a tactile theology where the body could trace the logic of the cosmos underfoot. The builders of these spaces worked like alchemists, turning base stone into spiritual language. Take the humble circle, a shape with no beginning or end. In medieval thought, it symbolized eternity, so they embedded it everywhere, from rose windows that fractured sunlight into stained glass parables to the round vaults of chapter houses where monks gathered. Even the act of laying out a church began with a circle scratched into the ground, a ritual called squaring the circle that fused earthly and divine geometry. And when they used squares like the quadripartite ribbed vaults overhead, it wasn't just for support. Each intersecting line represented the 4 elements, the 4 seasons, the 4 rivers of Eden. The very stones whispered cosmology. What's extraordinary is how this silent language bypassed literacy. A peasant who couldn't read Latin could still read the cathedral. The 12 columns supporting the choir, they stood for the 12 apostles. The 7 steps to the altar mirrored the 7 days of creation. Even the play of light at solstices became part of the story, like at Newgrange in Ireland, where dawn light pierces a tomb's passageway only on the winter solstice, a celestial clock built 5,000 years before Chartres. These weren't decorations, they were mnemonics, turning entire buildings into memory palaces for sacred stories. But sacred geometry's real power lay in its universality. A master mason from Germany could collaborate with a French architect because they shared this invisible lexicon. The same proportions appeared in Spanish synagogues and Islamic madrasas, proof that numbers transcended doctrinal divides. When Abbot Suger rebuilt St. Denis in the 12th century, he didn't just want a grand church, he wanted a lux continua, a continuous light shaped by geometry to lift souls toward the divine. The pointed arches and ribbed vaults weren't just Gothic innovations, they were deliberate channels for illumination, their angles calculated to draw the eye upward like a visual prayer. Now follow that upward gaze to where geometry's silent partner takes over, light. If stone was the parchment, then sunlight was the ink. Medieval architects didn't just let light in, they sculpted it, using geometry to turn rays into narrators. At Canterbury, a single shaft of noon light strikes the exact spot where Thomas Becket's shrine once stood, a luminous finger pointing to martyrdom. In St. Chapelle, the walls seem to dissolve into stained glass, with biblical scenes glowing like living tapestries. This wasn't decoration, it was alchemy. The blues in Charter's windows, made from cobalt melted into glass, were so vivid they were said to stain the very air with holiness. The genius of these designs was their dynamism. Unlike static paintings, light transformed spaces hourly. Morning sun might bathe a statue of the Virgin in gold, while evening light set the crucifix ablaze. Winter's low angles painted long narratives across floors, and summer's high sun turned vaults into celestial maps. Pilgrims returning year after year would find fresh stories in the interplay of stone and light, a perpetual advent calendar of revelation. And because glass was precious, often sponsored by guilds whose trades appeared in the corners, butchers, bakers, weavers, even the windows became communal chronicles, their radiance a shared inheritance. This marriage of geometry and light reached its zenith in the mystics' concept of lux spiritualis, light as divine wisdom. When a Cistercian monk sat in the stark white cloister of Fontenay, the unadorned walls didn't feel empty. They became screens for the ever-shifting play of shadows, turning contemplation into a kinetic art. In such spaces, silence wasn't absence, it was the canvas on which light painted its sermons. And perhaps that's the deepest lesson of these stone scriptures, that true meaning often lies not in what's said, but in what's framed, the pauses between notes, the shapes between lines, the light that waits centuries for the right moment to reveal its pattern. Light poured through stained glass like liquid scripture, each hue a wordless sermon in cobalt, ruby, and gold. At Chartres Cathedral, the famous Bible of the Poor, windows didn't just depict Bible stories, they dissolved walls into luminous parchment, where even an illiterate farmer could follow the life of Christ through shifting colors at their feet. This was theology written in light, a silent language where the sun itself became a preacher. Architects positioned windows like celestial conductors, orchestrating rays to strike specific points at precise moments. In Canterbury Cathedral, a single shaft of winter light still touches the spot where Thomas Becket's blood once stained the stones, an annual reenactment of martyrdom without a single spoken word. But light's silent narrative went deeper than storytelling. Whole buildings functioned as colossal sundials. The Abbey Church of Cluny Roman III had a hole in its vault called the Eye of God, casting a beam that traveled across the choir floor to mark canonical hours, a divine clock where monks could read time in sunlight rather than sand. Even the glass recipes were sacred alchemy. Chartres' famous Bleu de Chartres, blue contained cobalt from Persia, its depth so vibrant it was said to mimic the Virgin's robe, while red glass tinted with gold dust glowed like embers from a heavenly forge. These weren't decorations, they were engineered revelations, turning sunlight into a sacramental substance. Now, step beyond the visual into another silent language, acoustics. If light was architecture's brush, then sound, or its absence, was its chisel. Medieval builders shaped stone to conduct silence as deliberately as any Gregorian chant. Walk into the Cistercian Abbey of La Thoronet in Provence, and you'll notice something uncanny. The way your footsteps vanish into the walls. The monks engineered this. By using porous local limestone and precisely angled vaults, they created spaces where sound didn't echo but dissolved, as if the very stones absorbed human noise to preserve the purity of prayer. This wasn't accidental. The rule of Saint Benedict demanded silence during certain hours, so architects designed soundscapes to enforce it. Cloisters often featured fountains not just for water, but to mask whispers with gentle murmurs. In some Spanish monasteries, corridors curved slightly to prevent voices from carrying, while in others, choir stalls were positioned to amplify chant toward heaven but dampen sideways chatter. Even the famous whispering galleries found in places like Gloucester Cathedral weren't parlor tricks. They were spiritual tools, allowing confessional words to travel unheard except by their intended recipient. The most profound acoustic alchemy happened in chapter houses, where monks gathered for daily readings. Circular or polygonal in shape, these spaces concentrated voices toward a central lectern while minimizing reverberation, a design that let every brother hear clearly without straining. Durham Cathedral's chapter house goes further. Its pillars are precisely spaced to create sound shadows, areas where private conversations could occur even in a crowded room. This was social engineering in stone, using physics to shape community behavior. But perhaps the greatest acoustic miracle was how these silent spaces amplified inner voices. The same vaults that swallowed everyday noise seemed to magnify the clink of a censer or the turning of a parchment page into sacred punctuation. In such environments, even breath became audible, a constant reminder that speech was a gift not to be wasted. When a monk finally broke the silence to sing the divine office, his voice didn't just fill the church, it became architecture incarnate, vibrating through stones that had been waiting all day to resonate. What emerges is a breathtaking duality, buildings that were both megaphones and muzzles, amplifying the sacred while hushing the profane. This wasn't just functional design, it was philosophical. By controlling acoustics, medieval architects created environments where certain truths could be shouted across centuries, like the Psalms carved into choir stalls, while others remained as guarded as whispers between confessor and penitent. In an age before soundproofing, they achieved something we've nearly forgotten. That silence isn't the absence of noise, but the presence of intentional listening. Now consider how this acoustic wisdom traveled beyond cloisters. In Venetian council chambers, the same sound-dampening techniques prevented political leaks. University lecture halls borrowed monastic acoustics to ensure scholars' words reached every student. Even hospitals adopted whispering galleries to protect patients' dignity. The architecture of silence wasn't just preserving culture, it was refining human interaction itself, teaching societies to weigh words as carefully as masons weighed stones. And here lies the quiet revolution of these designs. They recognized that some messages need space to breathe. Just as stained glass transformed light into narrative, acoustic architecture turned silence into a vessel for secrets, for reverence, for truths too fragile to survive the clamor of the world. When we walk into a modern library or concert hall and instinctively lower our voices, we're not just being polite, we're obeying an 800-year-old design philosophy that understood what a building swallows is as important as what it sings aloud. The hush of a medieval cloister wasn't just empty space, it was a carefully tuned instrument. Architects shaped silence like sculptors, carving out quiet with vaulted ceilings that swallowed echoes and limestone walls that drank in whispers. At the Abbey of Fontenay in France, the very stones seemed to exhale stillness. The Cistercians who built it chose porous rock that muffled sound, transforming every corridor into a sanctuary where even a dropped quill would sound like an intrusion. This wasn't just about avoiding noise, it was about crafting an environment where the mind could hear itself think, where the divine might speak in the spaces between breaths. Now contrast that with the soaring nave of a Gothic cathedral. Here, silence had a different purpose, not to erase sound, but to prepare for it. The ribbed vaults and soaring heights weren't just feats of engineering. They were acoustic amplifiers designed to lift Gregorian chant into the heavens. When monks sang the Kyrie, their voices didn't just fill the space, they danced along the curves of the apse, bouncing off polished marble to create a living tapestry of harmony. The architects of places like Rheims Cathedral calculated every angle so that a single voice from the choir could reach a pilgrim at the far door, clear as a bell. This duality, spaces that either swallowed sound or exalted it, reveals a deeper philosophy. Medieval builders understood that silence wasn't monolithic. In the Scriptorium, it meant focus, the kind of quiet that let a scribe hear the scratch of his own pen as sacred text. In the chapter house, it meant clarity, where the abbot's words needed to carry without echo. Even the placement of fountains mattered. The gentle trickle in a cloister's garden wasn't just decorative, it masked distant noises with water's white noise, creating a bubble of privacy for prayer or study. Step onto the stone floors of Santiago de Compostela, and you'll feel another layer of this silent language. The worn slabs aren't just smooth from centuries of footsteps, they're slightly uneven by design. The subtle variations in height mean pilgrim steps create a rhythmic, almost musical pattern as they walk. It's a reminder that even movement could be part of the architecture of silence, each footfall a note in a larger, wordless liturgy. But the true marvel was how these acoustic principles traveled. Along the Camino de Santiago, pilgrims carried more than relics, they carried sonic blueprints. A monk from Cluny might hear the chant resonating in Leon Cathedral and bring that knowledge of vault angles back to Burgundy. Stonemasons swapped secrets like alchemists, learning that honey mixed into mortar could subtly sweeten a chapel's acoustics, or that alternating dense and porous stone in walls could filter street noise while preserving vocal clarity. This was a silent trade network where the physics of reverence crossed borders as easily as spices or silk. The genius of these designs is how they anticipated human behavior. In the hospital of St. John in Bruges, the sick lay under arches that funneled nurses' footsteps away from patients, while amplifying the sound of bells calling for aid. In university lecture halls descended from monastic designs, professors discovered their voices carried farther when they stood in specific spots, marking them with carved symbols we now call professors' stones. Even the labyrinthine corridors of castles borrowed from monastic acoustics, with spiral staircases placed to muffle approaching armies while amplifying the clang of alarm bells. What emerges is a revelation. Medieval silence wasn't passive. It was an active, almost living force shaped by geometry, refined by materials, and perfected through generations of trial and error. These architects didn't just build walls, they composed experiences, using stone and space to conduct attention like a conductor leading an invisible orchestra. And when we walk into a modern concert hall or library and feel that instinctive hush, we're not just following rules, we're obeying an 800-year-old design philosophy that understood silence as the canvas on which meaning is painted. Now follow those whispered echoes beyond the cloister walls, onto the roads that carried more than pilgrims, the highways of hidden knowledge. From the scallop shell markers of the Camino to the star-aligned paths leading to Mont Saint-Michel, these routes did more than guide footsteps. They wove a silent web across continents, connecting nodes of architectural wisdom where the language of stone and sound could leap oceans without a single word being spoken aloud. Pilgrimage routes were the silent arteries of medieval Europe, pulsing with footfalls instead of words. The Camino de Santiago didn't just connect towns, it wove together an entire continent's worth of architectural wisdom. Every monastery along its path, from the soaring spires of Roncesvalles to the humble chapel at O Sobrero, functioned like a chapter in a stone-built textbook. Pilgrims walking these roads weren't just travelers, they were unwitting students of a visual language carved into doorways and etched onto walls. Take the scallop shell motifs embedded in church facades. To modern eyes, they're decorative, but to a medieval pilgrim, each shell was a silent roadmap, its grooves radiating outward like paths converging on Santiago, a tactile reminder that all journeys lead to the divine. These routes transformed walking into a form of architectural literacy. As pilgrims moved westward, the churches grew taller, their vaults more daring, their stained glass more luminous, each building subtly teaching the theology of light through physical experience. A Burgundian farmer who'd never left his village could stand inside Leon Cathedral and understand transcendence without a single Latin lesson, simply by the way sunlight shattered through the rose window onto his upturned face. The roads themselves were carefully curated. Bridges like Puente la Reina weren't just crossings, their elegant arches mirrored cathedral doorways, turning river crossings into rehearsals for spiritual passage. Even the dirt underfoot carried meaning. Certain paths were lined with crushed seashells, so pilgrims would literally walk the scallop symbol that adorned their hats and satchels. Monastic way stations along these routes did more than offer bread and beds. Their layouts were silent tutors in contemplative living. Cloisters like those at Santo Domingo de la Calzada positioned their gardens so weary travelers would pass fragrant herbs before reaching the dormitory aromatherapy centuries before the term existed. Refugios often placed their wells in geometrically perfect courtyards, turning a drink of water into a meditation on the four rivers of Eden. And everywhere the architecture whispered guidance, niches for foot washing at entrances, strategically placed columns marking prayer stations, even the slope of stairs calibrated to slow, hurried steps into reverence. What's astonishing is how this silent network crossed linguistic borders. A German merchant and a Basque shepherd could both read the same architectural cues, the star motifs on Portuguese churches pointing toward celestial navigation, the increasingly ornate tympanums signaling proximity to holy sites. At Cruz de Ferro, the towering mound of stones left by generations of pilgrims wasn't just ritual. It was a visible record of communal journeying, each rock a silent testament to someone's passage. The roads themselves became living manuscripts, their very curves and inclines teaching patience like the final approach to Santiago, where the path deliberately wound through dense forests before revealing the cathedral spires, a masterclass in delayed revelation. Now follow those pilgrims as they step beyond stone walls into the next chapter of silent architecture, monastic gardens. If churches were the lungs of medieval spirituality, gardens were its breath spaces where nature itself became a sacred text. At St. Gall's legendary 9th century plan, the garden wasn't an afterthought but the abbey's beating heart, its quadrants dividing medicinal herbs from food crops with the same precision as a scribe ruling parchment. Here, silence took root literally in the rustle of sage leaves, the orderly rows of lavender buzzing with bees, the medicinal, physic gardens where each plant's placement corresponded to its healing properties. Monks didn't just grow plants, they curated a living library where time could speak of courage and rosemary whisper of remembrance. The genius of these gardens lay in their multi-sensory teaching. A blind pilgrim could read the garden by scent alone, mint for digestion near the infirmary, fragrant roses by the chapel to elevate prayer. At Cluny, the Cloister Garth circular path mirrored the cosmos, turning a simple stroll into celestial mimicry. Even the act of tending became silent liturgy. Cistercian vineyards were planted in strict grids not just for efficiency, but because the rhythm of pruning and harvesting mirrored the divine office's cyclical prayers. And when winter stripped the gardens bare, the underlying geometry remained a skeletal reminder that silence, too, had its seasons. Perhaps most remarkably, these gardens bridged sacred and practical knowledge without a word. The same monks who copied Aristotle in the Scriptorium grew peas in alternating rows with barley, silently demonstrating nitrogen fixation 6 centuries before science named it. At Canterbury's herbarium, the language of plant symbiosis, which species thrived side by side, taught lessons in community that echoed in the Cloisters' human relationships. This was observation as devotion, where a wilting lettuce could spark a sermon on humility, and the slow unfurling of a fern became a meditation on revelation. In these green sanctuaries, architecture didn't stop at garden walls. The very act of planting followed sacred geometry, rectangular beds echoing church naves, circular herb gardens mirroring rose windows. At Le Mans, the bishop's garden used concentric planting to create a living labyrinth, its kale and cabbages forming an edible mandala. Water features weren't merely decorative. The precise angles of irrigation channels at Poblet Abbey turned streams into liquid psalm verses, their burbling rhythms syncing with the monks' daily offices. Even the beehives, often shaped like miniature churches, whispered a truth that industry and contemplation could share the same hive. What emerges is a vision far beyond horticulture. These gardens were the medieval internet silent, decentralized networks of knowledge where a cutting from a Spanish monastery's rosemary bush might wind up in a French abbey's infirmary garden, carrying healing wisdom across borders. The same way pilgrims transported architectural ideas along the Camino, monks swapped seeds and planting techniques during church councils, turning soil into another parchment for preservation. When a 12th century herbalist at Salerno wrote that gardens were God's pharmacy, he wasn't being poetic. He was describing a living system where every leaf, petal, and root silently transmitted the same message. That nature itself was the oldest scripture, waiting to be read by anyone willing to walk its rows in reverent silence. Cloistered gardens weren't just plots of earth, they were living maps of the divine. Step into one, and you'd find yourself walking through a silent sermon written in rosemary and rue. The quadripartite design, 4 squares divided by stone paths, wasn't just practical, it was cosmology in miniature. Each quadrant mirrored one of Eden's 4 rivers, turning a simple herb bed into a portal to paradise. Monks didn't merely tend these gardens, they performed a slow, wordless liturgy with their hands. When they planted sage in the Pichon section or lavender near the Gihon path, they weren't following whims. They were reconstructing Genesis with every trowel of soil. But the real magic lay in how these spaces engaged all 5 senses without uttering a syllable. Run your fingers over lamb's ear, and its velvety leaves whispered lessons about gentleness. Crush mint between your palms, and its sharp fragrance became a call to clarity. Even the colors spoke: red roses for martyrs' blood, white lilies for Mary's purity, blue borage to mirror the heavens. At St. Gall's Abbey, the garden's central fountain wasn't just for irrigation. Its burble masked distant noises while its reflection doubled the sky, creating a pocket of perfect stillness where monks could hear scripture in rustling leaves. These gardens also held secrets of survival. Behind their beauty lay a meticulous catalogue of practical wisdom. Monks planted wormwood near latrines to repel insects, tucked feverfew by dormitories to soothe headaches, and trained vines over arbors to cool stone walkways in summer. The same hands that copied medical texts in the Scriptorium grew the very herbs described on those pages, a living pharmacopoeia where each plant's placement matched its use. Walk from the Jihan quadrant to Euphrates, and you'd pass from digestive aids to wound healing plants, as if strolling through an open-air hospital. Yet the most profound silence wasn't in the plants, but in the rituals surrounding them. Benedictine rules specified that gardening tools be blessed like sacred vessels, and that weeds be pulled not in haste but in rhythm with recited psalms. At Cluny, novices learned to prune grapevines by mimicking the abbot's deliberate cuts, each snip timed to an inward breath, turning viticulture into moving meditation. Even the compost heap held meaning. Its slow decay mirrored the monastic belief in transformation, where rot became rebirth under God's hand. Now, shift your gaze from these peaceful enclaves to their stark opposites, the looming fortresses where silence wasn't spiritual but strategic. If monastery gardens were Eden recalled, castles were Eden besieged. Here, architects weaponized quiet, designing spaces where the absence of sound could mean the difference between life and death. The same principles that made cloisters resonate with Chant were twisted to mull treason in throne rooms or muffle the approach of assassins. At Crac des Chevaliers, vaulted corridors swallowed the clank of armor, while in Dover's secret tunnels, whispers ricocheted off flint walls to alert guards of intruders. This was silence as armor, architecture as ally in a world where every creak might betray a kingdom. Fortresses mastered the art of silent intimidation, where stone itself became a psychological weapon. The moment an approaching army saw the sheer, windowless walls of a keep like Dover Castle, its flint face absorbing sound like a muffled threat, they understood violence might not be necessary. These weren't just buildings, they were chess pieces in a game of deterrence where the absence of noise spoke volumes. Arrow slits, those narrow vertical cuts in the walls, didn't just deflect attacks, they erased the archer's presence, turning defenders into invisible specters. Even the spiral staircases, always twisting clockwise as you ascended, forced right-handed invaders to fight at a disadvantage while defenders moved in practiced silence, their footfalls swallowed by the stone's perfect acoustics. Beneath these imposing structures lay another layer of silent warfare, the underground networks. At Crac des Chevaliers, hidden tunnels allowed defenders to appear and vanish like ghosts, their movements muffled by layers of compacted earth. Some passages were built with slightly sloping floors so spilled water would run toward secret listening posts, alerting guards to approaching enemies through the faintest trickle. Others featured murder holes in their ceilings, not just for dropping boiling oil, but for eavesdropping on conversations below, turning architecture into an intelligence-gathering tool. The silent efficiency of these spaces often made physical confrontation unnecessary. The mere possibility of hidden defenders could paralyze an invading force. What's fascinating is how this martial silence bled into governance. The same castles that intimidated enemies doubled as instruments of control over their own inhabitants. Great halls weren't just dining spaces but theaters of power, where the dais elevated the lord just enough to force visitors to crane their necks, a wordless reminder of hierarchy. At Kenilworth, the thickness of the chamber walls created pockets of perfect acoustics near the lord's seat, allowing him to overhear whispers from across the room while his own voice carried effortlessly. Even the placement of hearths was strategic, positioned to illuminate the ruler's face while leaving petitioners in shadow, playing with light and visibility like a silent interrogation. Now step beyond castle walls into the civic spaces where silence shaped societies. Town halls across medieval Europe borrowed from this architectural playbook, using design to enforce order without constant proclamation. In Bruges, the belfry's staircase wound in the opposite direction of castle stairs, a subtle cue that commerce, not combat, ruled here. The wooden beams of guild halls were often spaced at precise intervals to amplify the sound of a gavel while dampening side conversations, making dissent physically uncomfortable. Even market squares played with silence. The pillories placed near fountains weren't just about humiliation. The water's sound masked the victim's pleas, ensuring punishment unfolded without disruptive appeals. This civic silence reached its zenith in the law courts of places like Ghent or Lübeck. Here, the architecture itself became a referee. High ceilings with carefully angled vaults turned judges' voices into resonant pronouncements, while the accused stood in sunken docks where their words seemed to shrink into the stone. Some courtrooms featured truth arches, doorways built slightly narrower than shoulder width, forcing all who entered to turn sideways in a symbolic shedding of aggression. The most telling detail, the absence of seating. Standing trials weren't about efficiency. They ensured no one grew comfortable enough to waste the court's time, turning physical strain into an unspoken enforcer of brevity. What emerges is a revelation. Whether in fortress or forum, medieval architects understood that silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a tool for shaping behavior. The right curve of a vault could turn whispers into confessions, the strategic placement of a fountain could drown out dissent, and the mere slope of a stair could dictate the terms of engagement. These builders were psychologists in stone, crafting spaces where the architecture did the talking so rulers wouldn't have to. And perhaps that's their lasting legacy, the realization that true authority often speaks loudest when it says nothing at all. Now follow this thread from the halls of power to the humblest homes, where everyday people wielded silent architecture in their own quiet revolutions. The same principles that fortified castles found their way into peasant cottages not to intimidate but to endure. Thatch roofs weren't just cheap insulation. Their dense layers absorbed rain and muffled family arguments from prying ears. Central hearths did more than cook meals. Their smoke darkened rafters with a protective layer of creosote, while the chimney's drawer pulled gossip upward and away. Even the lowliest croft's doorway was often offset from the center, a small defiance making it harder for tax collectors to peer inside during assessments. In these modest spaces, silence became the people's armor, their architecture whispering resistance in every carefully placed beam. Town halls stood as stone-carved sermons on civic order, their every arch and aisle preaching obedience without uttering a word. In Bruges statues, the gilded statues of counts lining the facade weren't mere decoration. They formed a silent jury overseeing the square, their stone eyes reminding citizens that authority watched even when no official spoke. The vaulted ceiling inside didn't just impress visitors, it engineered humility, forcing upturned gazes that mirrored the posture of prayer. Mayors sat on elevated benches not for comfort, but so their voices would cascade downward like commandments from Sinai, amplified by walls angled to catch and carry every syllable to the farthest oak bench. The genius of these spaces lay in their manipulation of movement. Notice how the doors of Ghent's town hall were deliberately narrow, not to save on timber, but to force merchants and petitioners into single file, transforming bustling crowds into orderly queues before they even entered. Staircases rose in short, uneven steps, a clever trick to slow ambitious men's ascent and remind them that civic business demanded deliberation. Even the iron rings where horses were tethered outside sat just beyond earshot of open windows, ensuring private negotiations stayed private. This was behavioral science in stone, where architecture did the work of 100 bailiffs. Light played its part in this silent theater of power. Stained glass windows depicting local saints weren't placed randomly. They cast colored shafts onto the floor at precise hours, marking when petitions would be heard or judgments rendered. In York's Guildhall, the morning sun struck the mayor's seat exactly as markets opened, bathing him in celestial gold while leaving complainants in shadow. The message was unmistakable: divine right backed civic authority. Afternoon light then shifted to illuminate a wall carving of the Last Judgment, turning mundane tax disputes into moral allegories under its gaze. But the real masterstroke was how these halls weaponized acoustics. The raised wooden lectern in Lübeck's Rathaus didn't just elevate speakers. Its hollow base acted as a natural amplifier, making even whispered ordinances audible across the hall. Conversely, the thick tapestries behind the council benches absorbed dissenting murmurs before they could spread. Some halls employed whispering corners, where angled stonework carried secrets between officials, while general announcements echoed off parabolic walls to reach the square outside. This precise control over who could hear what turned architecture into an information filter, separating privileged knowledge from public decree. Perhaps most remarkably, these designs functioned across literacy levels. A farmer who couldn't read Latin could understand his place in society simply by where he was permitted to stand: the patterned tiles near the dais for guild masters, rough-hewn stones by the door for common folk. The towering height of the chamber didn't just cool the air, it physically embodied the gulf between rulers and ruled. Even the iron chandeliers served dual purposes, their height adjustable by chain to light important treaties, but also removable as makeshift gallows when justice required visual punctuation. Now follow the civic thread from halls of judgment to houses of healing, where medieval architects wielded silence as a balm rather than a blade. In the Hospital of Santo Spirito in Rome, the cloisters weren't just pretty walkways, their repeating arches created rhythmic shadows that paced the hours of rest like a visual metronome. Patients lying in the long infirmary hall could track their recovery by how many window shafts of light they could count on the opposite wall, turning time itself into a measurable medicine. The sisters who worked there moved through a carefully choreographed silence. Their hemp-soled shoes whispered across floors sloped slightly toward drains, carrying away impurities without clatter or fuss. Here, architectural silence became therapeutic. Thick walls of tufa stone in Florentine hospitals absorbed fever's delirium, while strategically placed fountains masked coughs with water's white noise. Beds faced east not just for morning light, but so patients would wake to see frescoes of resurrection, a daily dose of hope baked into the walls. Even the herbs hanging from rafters served acoustic purposes. Their rustling leaves disrupted the moans of the suffering, preventing panic from spreading through the wards. This was architecture as healer, where every stone and beam conspired to cradle broken bodies back to wholeness through the alchemy of intentional quiet. The same principles that enforced order in town halls here fostered restoration. At Bones Hotel Dieu, the multicolored roof tiles visible from patient beds weren't mere decoration. Their diamond pattern gave fevered eyes a focal point to rest upon, preventing delirium. Night corridors curved gently to keep lantern light from disturbing sleepers, while the pharmacy's copper utensils were lined with felt to mute their clanging. Most ingenious of all were the revolving food hatches between kitchen and ward. Their circular design allowed meals to pass without doors banging or kitchen noise intruding. What emerges is a profound duality. Medieval architects understood that silence could both compel and comfort, could brace a citizen before the law as surely as it could soothe a patient toward recovery. Whether in halls of power or halls of healing, these spaces shared a common language written in stone and shadow, proving that true authority often speaks loudest when it chooses not to speak at all. And perhaps that's their enduring lesson, that architecture's most powerful statements are sometimes the ones it whispers. hospitals of the medieval world understood something modern medicine is only now rediscovering: that silence heals. Walk through the arched entrance of the Ospedale di Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, and you'd immediately feel the hush settle over you like a cool cloth. The thick limestone walls, layered with hollow cavities filled with crushed brick, weren't just structural, they were sonic filters, absorbing the clatter of carts and cries of the city outside. Patients rested in wards designed as precise rectangles, their proportions mirroring the harmonious ratios of musical intervals, because architects believed mathematical harmony in space could coax the body back to balance. Even the window placements followed a silent logic, high enough to let in light but low enough to block street noise, their shutters lined with wool to muffle the clang of church bells. Healing wasn't left to chance in these spaces. The Sisters of Charity moved through the wards in felt-soled shoes, their footfalls vanishing into the herringbone-patterned brick floors. At the Hospital of the Holy Spirit in Rome, the cloistered courtyard wasn't just for beauty. Its central fountain's gentle trickle masked nighttime coughing fits, while the surrounding portico's repeating arches created a visual rhythm that calmed fevered minds. Every architectural choice served dual purposes. The vaulted ceilings in Bones Hotel amplified the chanting of prayers for communal comfort, but dampened the sounds of suffering, their curved surfaces scattering whispers into harmless echoes. The genius lay in how these hospitals turned passive silence into active therapy. In the fever wards of Santo Spirito, beds faced east not just for morning light, but so patients would wake to see frescoes of resurrection scenes, a daily dose of hope baked into the walls. Herbs hung drying from the rafters weren't merely storage. Their rustling leaves disrupted the moans of the dying, preventing panic from spreading like contagion. Even the pharmacy's copper mortars were lined with linen to mute their grinding, ensuring the making of medicine didn't disturb its taking. Perhaps most remarkably, these principles crossed religious divides. Jewish hospitals in Cordoba borrowed the same quieting techniques, using courtyard orange groves to purify air and scent simultaneously, while Islamic Bimaristans in Damascus engineered ventilation shafts that whispered cool air over patients without draft. The shared understanding was universal. Healing required sanctuary, not just from disease but from the world's noise. When surgeons at Salerno's medical school wrote that quiet is the first dressing for any wound, they weren't being poetic. They were describing an architectural prescription. Now follow this thread from the hush of infirmaries to the quiet intensity of medieval universities, where silence wasn't just enforced but engineered into the very stones. The lecture halls of Bologna and Oxford didn't rely on shushing librarians. They were designed as acoustic amplifiers, their barrel-vaulted ceilings focusing a professor's voice like a lens concentrates light. Students perched on tiered wooden benches weren't just sitting in rows. They formed a human soundboard, their bodies absorbing errant echoes while the angled floor carried the master's words to every ear. Even the placement of windows mattered, north-facing to avoid glare on parchment, but slightly ajar to create a gentle cross breeze that kept minds alert without the distraction of slamming shutters. Here, silence was the scaffold for scholarship. The carrels at the University of Paris's Sorbonne Library weren't just study nooks. Their high-sided wooden partitions created individual sonic chambers, isolating thinkers from their neighbors' rustling pages. Copyists in the Scriptorium worked under rules forbidding even the clearing of throats, not out of cruelty but because the architecture itself demanded it. The room's perfect acoustic focus meant a single cough could derail a dozen lines of transcription. And when disputations grew heated in the debating halls, the circular, Magister's stone in the center didn't just mark where to stand. Its peculiar resonance made speakers unconsciously moderate their tone, as the stone amplified wisdom but swallowed ranting. What united hospitals and universities was this profound medieval insight, that certain human endeavors require ecosystems of quiet to thrive. Whether mending bodies or expanding minds, the architects of these spaces knew that true progress often happens not in shouts, but in the spaces between them, where stone and shadow conspire to cradle thought and healing alike. Their legacy whispers to us still that sometimes the most powerful interventions aren't what we add to a space, but what we deliberately leave out. Universities of the medieval world were cathedrals of contemplation, their very stones engineered to cradle quiet thought. Step into Oxford's earliest lecture halls, and you'd notice how the walls curved inward like cupped hands, not for beauty, but to catch and amplify a master's voice without echo. Those steeply tiered benches weren't just seating, they were acoustic terraces, ensuring even the softest commentary from a scholar like Grosseteste could reach the back row. The libraries took this further, with carrels designed as miniature cloisters, high-sided wooden stalls where a student's breath might fog the air in winter, so complete was the silence wrapping them. This wasn't accidental. Medieval scholars understood that deep learning required architecture to act as a mental trellis. The quadrangles of Cambridge's colleges didn't just mirror monastery courtyards by coincidence. Their covered walkways created sheltered paths for pacing with a book, turning physical movement into intellectual rhythm. Even the placement of windows followed a silent logic, positioned north facing to bathe manuscripts in shadowless light, their leaded panes slightly warped to diffuse chatter from the streets below. At the University of Paris, the Stone of Wisdom in the Sorbonne's debate hall wasn't merely symbolic. Its peculiar resonance amplified reasoned arguments while swallowing emotional outbursts, as if the building itself rewarded cool logic. The real brilliance lay in how these spaces trained attention. Library desks sloped imperceptibly just enough to keep a drowsy student from resting their head, while inkwells were recessed into the wood to prevent clattering spills. At Bologna's law school, the circular lecture halls forced eye contact between disputants, their curved walls reflecting sound inward to create a bubble of intense focus. Even the staircases played their part. The twisted spiral at Padua's Bow Palace wasn't just space-saving. Its uneven steps demanded careful footing, a physical metaphor for the deliberate ascent of knowledge. What's astonishing is how this silent framework crossed disciplines. Medical students at Salerno dissected cadavers in purpose-built theaters with tiered silent observation, decks architecture acknowledging that some truths are best absorbed wordlessly. The astronomy towers of Charles University in Prague featured whispering galleries beneath their star charts, where a professor's murmured calculations could travel clearly to assistants without disturbing the night's observations. Even the student taverns near these universities borrowed the acoustics, with barrel-vaulted cellars that carried warnings of approaching proctors from the door to the back tables. Now turn from these halls of quiet contemplation to the bridges that stitched medieval Europe together, structures that spoke volumes without uttering a word. The Pont d'Avignon wasn't just a river crossing. Its missing arches told silent tales of floods and financial ruin, while the chapel midway across transformed every passerby into a pilgrim. London Bridge's crowded houses and narrow passage forced travelers into single file, its very congestion whispering warnings about urban chaos. But the real genius lay in bridges like the Ponte Vecchio, where the goldsmith shops lining its span weren't just commercial. Their identical arches and uniform heights created a rhythmic visual language that said Florentine order as clearly as any herald's proclamation. These bridges were more than stone and mortar. They were ideograms in 3 dimensions. The fortified gate towers of the Charles Bridge in Prague didn't just defend, they staged a silent power play, forcing visitors to pass under the gaze of Bohemian kings before entering the city. The humpback design of many medieval spans wasn't purely structural. It created a deliberate moment of pause at the apex, offering travelers a vista where the surrounding landscape could imprint itself on memory. Even the bridge chapels, like the one at Duenstein, served as silent waypoints where the weary could rest beneath frescoes telling biblical journeys that mirrored their own. What united universities and bridges was this medieval mastery of silent communication, the understanding that architecture could educate, warn, inspire, or command without a single shouted order. Whether through a library carol's focused solitude or a bridge's imposing silhouette, these structures proved that sometimes the most enduring messages are the ones carved not in parchment, but in stone and space. Bridges stretched across medieval Europe like stone sutures, stitching together fractured landscapes with silent eloquence. The Pont Saint-Bénézet in Avignon wasn't just a way to cross the Rhône. Its staggered arches and midway chapel turned every passage into a pilgrimage, where travelers paused to touch the relic of Saint Nicholas before continuing their journey. The bridge's missing spans spoke louder than any chronicle, their absence whispering of floods and financial struggles that even kings couldn't conquer. Meanwhile, London bridges crammed houses and narrow passage forced merchants into single file. Its very congestion a mute testament to urban chaos barely held in check by architectural order. What made these structures extraordinary wasn't their engineering alone, it was how they choreographed human interaction without uttering a word. The Ponte Vecchio's symmetrical shopfronts, all uniform height and width, weren't just aesthetic choices. They broadcast Florence's mercantile ideals, where even goldsmiths bowed to communal harmony in their facades. The bridge's central opening framed the Arno like a painting, insisting that commerce and beauty share the same vista. Further north, the Charles Bridge's towering gatehouses did more than defend Prague. They staged a silent power play, forcing everyone from peasant to prince to pass beneath the gaze of Bohemian monarchs carved into the stone. Rituals unfolded on these spans like unspoken liturgies. At Duenstein's Danube crossing, the bridge chapel's worn threshold marked where generations of travelers had instinctively lowered their voices. Its frescoes of Saint John Nepomuk, patron saint of bridges, reminding them that some passages demand reverence. Toll collectors didn't just take coins, they stood at precise intervals where the bridge's acoustics amplified their calls, turning mundane transactions into performances of authority. Even the humpback design of many medieval bridges served silent psychology. That slight incline at the center forced a moment's pause, offering pilgrims and merchants alike a vista to imprint on memory before descending into unfamiliar territory. Now follow those travelers as they step off the bridge's last stone and into the next theater of silent communication, the marketplace. If bridges were Europe's connective tissue, market squares were its beating heart, where architecture orchestrated commerce without signage or shouting. The cloth halls of Ypres and Bruges didn't need banners to declare their purpose. Their soaring wooden vaults and rows of identical stalls formed a visual rhythm that even illiterate farmers could follow. The cobblestones underfoot weren't randomly laid, their patterns radiated outward from the weighing house like spokes on a wheel, silently guiding carts toward inspection points. In these bustling spaces, silence took cunning forms. The stepped platforms before Rowan's butter market weren't just for display. Their graduated heights created a natural amphitheater where a crier's voice could travel farthest when announcing prices. The iron rings bolted into Exeter's market cross didn't merely tether horses, they spaced vendors at precise intervals to prevent arguments over territory. Even the shadows played their part. At Cordoba's silk market, the colonnades cast cooling shade in summer, but stood just far enough apart to let winter sunlight warm the stones where merchants spread their wares. But the real genius lay in how these squares encoded fairness into their very bones. The pillory wasn't placed at the market's edge for convenience. Its central position made dishonest traders endure the shame of every passerby. The octagonal design of Siena's Campo went beyond beauty. Its sloping pavement funneled rainwater toward drains while creating natural sightlines to the town hall's balcony, where officials could survey transactions without descending into the fray. And in the cloth towns of Flanders, the market belfries didn't just tell time, their bells' distinct tones signaled when bargaining could begin, when weights would be checked, and when the day's last deal must be sealed, turning bronze peels into an invisible hand guiding the dance of commerce. What emerges is a revelation. Medieval markets weren't free-for-alls, but carefully scored symphonies where architecture conducted human behavior. From the width of aisles designed to slow hurried shoppers, to the placement of fountains where gossip could be overheard by authorities, every stone and post whispered instructions. Like bridges, these spaces proved that the most powerful rules aren't always written. Sometimes they're paved into the ground beneath our feet, waiting for our footsteps to give them voice. Marketplaces thrived on unspoken rules written not in ledgers, but in stone and spatial design. Step into the grand place of Brussels, and the very cobblestones underfoot told traders where to stand, their diamond pattern radiating outward from the guildhalls like silent spokes of a commercial wheel. Covered walkways weren't just shelter from rain. They created natural aisles where foot traffic flowed like water through channels, guided by the slope of the pavement toward the cloth hall or grain market. The central cross in towns like Salisbury didn't merely mark the square's heart. Its four arms pointed to specialized zones: textiles to the north, spices to the east, eliminating the need for shouted directions. Guildhalls dominated these squares not by volume but by silent symbolism. Their stepped gables and gilded statues weren't vanity projects. Each architectural flourish whispered status to illiterate and scholar alike. In Gent's Hall, the absence of windows at street level wasn't an oversight. It forced buyers to crane their necks upward to the guildmaster's balcony, physically enacting deference before bargaining began. The timber frames of lesser stalls bowed slightly outward, a deliberate cue that temporary vendors occupied lower rungs than the stone-built guilds. Even the materials spoke: butchers' stalls lined with easy-to-scour marble, apothecaries' shelves of porous volcanic rock to keep herbs dry. Every surface taught hygiene standards without a single posted rule. The real genius lay in how these spaces managed chaos through geometry. Exeter's market used concentric circles of stalls, permanent stone ones for established merchants at the center, movable wooden booths for itinerant sellers at the edges. This wasn't just organization. It created a silent filtration system where quality goods naturally migrated inward, while new entrants proved their worth on the periphery. In Italian hill towns, the marketplace often sat at the town's steepest point, not for punishment but so spilled liquids would wash away debris downhill, turning gravity into a silent sanitation worker. Cultural exchange happened in these silent interstices. A Hanseatic merchant might not speak Flemish, but he understood the universal language of Bruges' belfry, its noontime chime signaling the shift from wholesale to retail trade. The numbered stones embedded in Florence's Mercato Nuovo weren't decoration. They marked where German bankers could set up temporary tables, their assigned positions eliminating territorial disputes. Even the height of market fountains served diplomacy, their basins deliberately low so Moorish, Jewish, and Christian traders could all ritually wash hands without doctrinal conflict. Now follow the merchant's home not to rest, but to discover how domestic spaces became fortresses of silent tradition. The steep staircases of Tallinn's merchant houses weren't just space savers. Their twisting ascent forced visitors to approach the family's living quarters' right shoulder first, keeping sword arms pinned against the wall in a wordless disarmament. In Bruges, the spakehuis or talking room wasn't named for chatter. Its walls lined with wool tapestries absorbed confidential trade secrets, while the hallway's creaky floorboards announced eavesdroppers. Even the humble hearth held silent lessons. Its central placement in peasant cottages wasn't just for warmth, but so children could learn cooking techniques through observation rather than interruption. These homes preserved craft knowledge through architectural mnemonics. A weaver's cottage in Norwich had ceiling beams notched with growth rings, a tactile calendar reminding when to shear sheep based on tree physiology. The staggered shelves in a French vintner's cellar weren't haphazard. Their spacing allowed each barrel to be turned precisely 1/4 per season without verbal instruction. In alpine regions, farmhouses stored hay in attics not just for dryness, but because the scent filtering through floorboards silently taught generations which grasses made the sweetest milk. What emerges is a revelation. Medieval people didn't need signage or speeches to sustain their world. From the choreographed chaos of markets to the wisdom etched into floor plans, they built ecosystems where space itself could educate, negotiate, and perpetuate culture. The real transaction wasn't just goods for coin, it was the silent exchange of trust, tradition, and ingenuity passed down through stones that still speak if we know how to listen. Domestic architecture held entire cosmologies in its quiet corners where the simple act of placing a hearth could whisper volumes about who wielded power in a household. The medieval home wasn't just shelter, it was a three-dimensional ledger of family life, its walls recording unspoken rules as clearly as scribes notched tallies on parchment. Take the humble Crook house, its curved timber frames rising like ribs from the earth. The central hearth didn't merely warm bones, it anchored the social universe, its flickering light dictating hierarchy, parents on the cushioned bench to its right, children and servants radiating outward into shadowed peripheries. Even the smoke curling upward through the roof's smoke hole carried meaning, a visible sacrifice to the heavens that turned daily meals into silent rituals. Sleeping arrangements mapped invisible boundaries with startling precision. In Burgundian farmsteads, box beds built into walls weren't just space savers. Their carved wooden shutters could be latched from within, creating private sanctuaries in communal living. The master bed always stood slightly elevated, not for comfort but to ensure waking eyes surveilled the room below. A wordless assertion of authority reinforced every sunrise. Meanwhile, in urban dwellings like those of York's merchants, second-story solas jutted over bustling streets, their cantilevered floors creating private retreats where business deals could unfold beyond eavesdropping neighbors. Privacy wasn't an afterthought, it was architecture's conspiracy against the public gaze. Storage spaces held their own silent lectures. The lockable aumbry cupboard in a prosperous peasant's home didn't just safeguard salt and spices. Its iron hinges and intricate carvings announced the family's wealth without crass displays. In alpine regions, cheese lofts positioned above hearths weren't merely practical, their precise height taught generations the exact warmth needed for aging wheels, turning rafters into unwritten recipe books. Even the humble butter shelf near north-facing windows whispered domestic wisdom, its cool draft preserving dairy while the family slept. Decorative choices spoke in a visual shorthand accessible to all. The red ochre walls of a Breton fisherman's cottage weren't just cheerful. The pigment's iron content naturally repelled damp and mold. In Flanders, the checkerboard patterns painted on shutters secretly signaled guild affiliations to literate and illiterate alike. The carved witch posts in Yorkshire homes' twisted columns near entryways did more than fascinate visitors. Their spirals were thought to trap malicious spirits, turning superstition into structural features. Now witness how these domestic whispers crescendoed into fortification shouts. Defensive walls didn't just repel invaders, they staged silent psychological warfare. The concentric rings of Carcassonne's ramparts weren't merely tactical. Their repeating pattern created a hypnotic rhythm meant to unsettle approaching armies. Arrow slits shaped like crosses did double duty, funneling deadly fire while reminding attackers of divine judgment. Even the crenellation's teeth held meaning. Wider merlons in Spanish castles signaled Christian reconquest, their bulkier silhouettes declaring reclaimed territory against the sky. The real genius lay in how these walls manipulated perception. The slightly inward tilt of Constantinople's Theodosian walls made scaling ladders slide unpredictably, while their alternating bands of brick and limestone weren't decorative. They absorbed and dispersed siege engine impacts like shock absorbers. At Crac des Chevaliers, the outer curtain wall stood just low enough to conceal the taller inner defenses, luring enemies into deadly kill zones they couldn't anticipate. These weren't passive barriers, they were chess players in stone, anticipating moves before opponents drew breath. Most powerfully, these fortifications spoke to their own communities. The night watchman's path along Chester's walls was paved with loose stones, not from neglect, but to amplify approaching footsteps against sneak attacks. In Rothenburg ob der Tauber, the covered sentry walks doubled as sheltered market stalls during peacetime, their dual purpose whispering that security and commerce were intertwined. Even the thickness of gates held messages. The 20-inch oak of York's Micklegate Bar didn't just block invaders, it visibly demonstrated civic prosperity to visiting merchants, turning defense into advertisement. What emerges is a silent dialogue between home and rampart, where domestic intimacy and civic defiance shared an architectural vocabulary. The same principles that guarded family secrets in latched shutters were amplified to protect entire cities, proving that whether built for comfort or combat, medieval structures were always in conversation with the world, even when they chose not to shout. City walls rose like stone proclamations, their sheer faces telling travelers everything they needed to know before reaching the gates. The moment a merchant glimpsed the 30-foot-high ramparts of Carcassonne shimmering in the distance, they understood this was a place that took its security seriously. But these weren't just defensive barriers, they were psychological chess moves carved in limestone. The slight outward slope of York's walls made scaling ladders slide treacherously, while the alternating bands of light and dark stone in Constantinople's defenses weren't decorative. They created an optical illusion that made estimating distance nearly impossible for attacking archers. Gates functioned as silent interrogators, their architecture designed to extract compliance without words. The staggered entryways of Avila's walls forced approaching visitors into a zigzag path, eliminating the momentum of charging cavalry. Above, murder holes in the ceiling threatened unseen dangers, their shadows crossing the threshold like warning stripes. Portcullises didn't just drop, they descended with the deliberate slowness of a judge's gavel, their iron teeth biting into stone grooves worn smooth by generations of cautious lowering. Even the gatehouse's height played mind games, towering enough to force visitors to crane their necks, imprinting subconsciously that they were entering someone else's domain. Walk the parapets and you discover how these walls fostered belonging through silent choreography. The night watchman's path in Chester was paved with loose stones not from neglect, but to amplify approaching footsteps, a built-in alarm system that turned every guard's round into a communal reassurance. Arrow slits weren't just defensive. Their cruciform shapes cast moving shadow crosses on the cobbles below during feast days, transforming martial architecture into seasonal sundials. In Rothenburg, the covered sentry walks doubled as sheltered market stalls during peacetime, their dual purpose whispering that commerce and security were two sides of the same coin. The real genius lay in how these walls spoke different languages to different audiences. To outsiders, they boasted of military might through sheer mass and impregnable gates. But to citizens within, they hummed a quieter lullaby of stability, their thickness blocking bitter winter winds, their walkways providing elevated routes during flood seasons, their towers storing grain as reliably as they spotted enemies. Children learned civic pride by tracing family initials in the mortar, while elders pointed out where their grandfathers had repaired siege damage, turning stone into a living family album. Now follow the shadow of these mighty walls downhill to where another silent engineering marvel waited, the medieval water systems that turned gravity into a servant. Beneath seemingly quiet streets, aqueducts and channels whispered with the sound of water obeying unspoken commands. In Siena, the Bettini tunnels didn't just deliver water. Their vaulted ceilings collected condensation into secondary channels, a backup system that worked without pumps or protest. The public fountains of Bruges weren't merely decorative. Their lion-headed spouts were calibrated to different heights, providing drinking water for humans at chest level, while troughs at knee level served livestock, all from the same pressurized source. This hydraulic harmony reached its zenith in places like Toledo, where Moorish water wheels lifted river water uphill through hidden conduits, their wooden gears muffled by wool padding to avoid disturbing the night watch. In monastery precincts, rainwater channels etched into cloister walkways did double duty, carrying away storm runoff while marking prayer intervals with their gurgling rhythm. Even the humble well curb told silent stories. Its worn grooves revealed decades of rope patterns, while the thickness of its walls hinted at the depth of the water table below. Where city walls shouted defiance, water systems murmured reassurance, both proving that true engineering genius often speaks loudest when it doesn't speak at all. Water flowed through medieval cities like a silent promise, clean, constant, and engineered to be heard only when necessary. Beneath the cobblestone streets of places like Siena and Bruges, networks of lead and wooden pipes whispered along their routes, their joints wrapped in hemp to muffle the knocking of water against metal. Public fountains weren't mere utilities. They were hydraulic theaters where design and function performed in perfect harmony. The lion-headed spouts of Bruges Market Fountain, for example, delivered water at staggered heights, hired jets for filling buckets, lowered trickles for weary horses to drink without splashing passers-by. Even the basins were calibrated, their broad rims doubling as impromptu meeting tables where merchants could seal deals over the sound of flowing water. The real artistry lay in how these systems balanced visibility and secrecy. Aqueducts like those feeding Toledo's Alcazar ran partially exposed along arches, their grandeur advertising civic pride, then vanished underground near residential areas to spare citizens the gurgling echoes of diverted rivers. Cisterns beneath monasteries collected rainwater through channels so finely tuned that during storms, overflow cascades were directed into ornamental gardens rather than noisy streets. At Clairvaux Abbey, the Cistercians engineered their water system to flush latrines at predictable intervals, using gravity's silent pull to maintain hygiene without disturbing prayer. Tombs, by contrast, spoke through absence their hollow chambers and sealed sarcophagi guarding not just bodies, but the unbroken thread of memory. The stone effigies of Westminster Abbey weren't merely decorations. Their crossed arms and serene faces offered silent lessons in piety to illiterate visitors. Underground crypts like those in St. Denis used strategic acoustics, their barrel-vaulted ceilings amplifying chanting during requiems while swallowing the clatter of mourners' footsteps. Even the positioning of tombs held meaning. The circular arrangement of Plantagenet burials at Fontevraud Abbey mirrored celestial patterns, turning death into a silent echo of cosmic order. What united water systems and tombs was their mastery of invisible labor. Just as aqueducts moved liquid without pumps, tombs preserved legacies without words. The lead-lined burial caskets of medieval bishops slowed decay not through embalming, but through airtight engineering, a physical counterpart to the spiritual immortality they preached. In Canterbury Cathedral, the subtle slope of the crypt's floor channeled condensation away from relics, proving that even in death, architecture remained dutiful. These silent technologies whispered a truth we've since forgotten, that some of civilization's greatest triumphs aren't in what's announced, but in what endures unnoticed. Tombs and memorials stood as stone biographies, their silent eloquence outlasting the voices they commemorated. Walk through the crypt of St. Denis Abbey outside Paris, where the effigies of French kings lie in solemn procession, each figure carved with hands clasped in eternal prayer, their crossed legs signaling participation in the Crusades. These weren't just sculptures, they were frozen chronicles, their details readable as any parchment. The slight tilt of a queen's head toward her husband spoke of dynastic alliances, while the lion at a knight's feet whispered of battlefield valor. Even the materials held meaning: Purbeck marble for nobility, local limestone for gentry, a geological language of status that required no herald to interpret. Village churchyards told quieter but no less poignant stories. The uneven rows of tilting headstones in an English hamlet weren't haphazard. Their east-west alignment mirrored the rising sun, a silent promise of resurrection. Simple crosses bore weathering patterns that revealed generations of family touch, the smoothed left edge where a widow rested her hand each Sunday, the lichen-free patch where children traced their ancestors' name. In Wales, poor man's tombs used riverbed stones arranged in cryptic patterns, their spirals and grids encoding the deceased's trade. A fisherman's grave might ripple outward like water rings, while a blacksmith's rested under an arch of iron-rich rocks that rusted into vivid memorials after rain. The spatial choreography of these sites turned grief into geometry. At Westminster Abbey, the distance between a royal tomb and the high altar measured spiritual proximity as clearly as court documents recorded political favor. Burgundian dukes took this further, commissioning multi-level tombs where their carved likenesses appeared twice, as living rulers in ceremonial robes on the upper slab, and as naked corpses below, a silent memento mori for visitors. Even the humblest burials followed this visual rhetoric. Italian merchant families clustered their dead beneath chapel floors in precise kinship patterns, their resting places forming stone genealogies visible only when candlelight raked across the pavement. Light itself became part of the silent dialogue. The weep holes in ledger stones weren't just drainage. They allowed flickering votive candles to illuminate the deceased's name from below, as if the letters kindled from within. In Portugal's Alcobaça Monastery, the tombs of star-crossed lovers Pedro and Ini Circumflex face each other across the nave, a deliberate alignment ensuring their sculpted faces catch the morning light on opposite walls, their stone gazes reunited daily by the sun's passage. The most profound messages often lay in absence. The empty tomb slabs of crusaders who died overseas, their blank surfaces bearing silent witness to bodies lost in distant sands. Now step from these hushed sanctuaries into the vibrant silence of medieval theater, where architecture and staging spoke louder than any soliloquy. The pageant wagons of York's mystery plays transformed city squares into episodic Bibles, their three-tiered designs mirroring heaven, earth, and hell without a single painted label. Trapdoors in the stage floor didn't just enable special effects, they created a vertical language. Saints ascended through clouds of hidden incense, while villains vanished into smoking pits, their fates literally mapped along the axis of morality. Even the wagon's route through town became part of the drama, with stops at predetermined locations turning the entire city into a stage where salvation history unfolded block by block. Indoor theatres like London's Blackfriars mastered more subtle acoustics. Their U-shaped galleries focused sound toward paying patrons in the pit while muffling the rustling of nobles inside boxes, a sonic stratification as deliberate as any castle's arrow slits. The tiring house walls behind stages were often angled to bounce an actor's voice toward key audience segments, creating invisible channels of emphasis. When Hamlet held Yorick's skull in the globe's central discovery space, the architecture conspired to make his whispers audible to the farthest groundling, a technological marvel that turned quiet contemplation into shared experience. What united tombs and theaters was this medieval genius for spatial storytelling. Whether through the eternal stillness of carved effigies or the dynamic silence of an actor's pause, both forms understood that architecture could shape meaning without uttering a word. They left us a powerful legacy, that sometimes the most enduring truths aren't shouted from rooftops, but whispered through stone, light, and the careful arrangement of space. Theaters of the Middle Ages turned architecture into an unspoken actor, crafting narratives not just through dialogue, but through the silent choreography of space itself. Picture the pageant wagons of York's mystery plays rolling through cobbled streets, their three-tiered stages transforming entire cities into living scripture. Heaven perched atop gilded platforms, earth sprawled across the middle level, while hell lurked below through trapdoors belching sulphurous smoke. No microphones were needed when the wagon's design funneled a prophet's voice downward, making his warnings ripple through the crowd like seismic tremors. The very tilt of these mobile stages ensured even spectators at the back could read the moral universe in its vertical alignment, salvation literally elevated, damnation crouching beneath their feet. Open-air amphitheaters like Valenciennes' annual Passion Play took this further, engineering sightlines with mathematical precision. Circular seating wasn't just about crowd control. It created a communal gaze where thousands of eyes converged on the central plateau, turning spectators into participants. The ground itself sloped gently, not by accident, but so whispered laments from the Virgin Mary would travel uphill to the farthest benches. Even the timing of performances bowed to architectural wisdom. Afternoon shows positioned the setting sun behind the crucifixion scene, bathing the Calvary Hill in apocalyptic red as Christ's final words rang out. Guilds responsible for these productions embedded silent cues into every element. When the Chester Bakers Guild staged The Last Supper, their bread-filled table aligned with the real-life bakery street, merging theatrical and actual nourishment. The Norwich Weavers Guild hung tapestries behind their creation play that mirrored their workshop patterns, threading commerce into cosmology. These weren't just sets, they were mnemonic devices anchoring biblical stories to the tactile world of trades. A fishmonger watching the miracle of the loaves would spot the same woven fish baskets his wife used at market, making the divine feel as familiar as his daily catch. The real magic lay in how these spaces choreographed collective emotion. In Lucian's Easter play, the square before the town hall became Gethsemane by moonlight, its fountain transformed into the garden's olive press. As actors retreated toward the pillared courthouse, suddenly recast as Jerusalem's gates, the architecture itself heightened the drama. No narrator needed to explain betrayal. The abrupt shift from open square to claustrophobic colonnades made the crowd feel Judas's treachery in their bones. Similarly, Lincoln's Harrowing of Hell used the cathedral's west door as the mouth of the underworld, its gaping arch swallowing sinners whole before spewing them back out redeemed at dawn. Now step from these vibrant street performances into the hushed halls where guilds encoded practical wisdom into their very walls. The London Fishmongers' Hall wasn't just a meeting place. Its tide charts carved into oak beams predicted the Thames' ebb and flow centuries before printed almanacs. In Ghent's Cloth Hall, the numbered iron rings along the walls weren't mere decoration. They marked where apprentices should stretch wet fabric to dry at precise tensions, turning the building into a giant loom. Even the ceiling beams in Strasbourg's Tanners Guild bore knife-notched calendars, their grooves tracking optimal hide-curing phases by the moon cycles. These halls were living textbooks. The Brewers' Guild of Brussels built their meeting room over a natural spring, its water temperature constant year-round, a silent reference for ideal mashing heats. At the Parisian Goldsmiths' Hall, the north-facing windows filtered light perfectly for spotting impurities in molten metal, while the angled worktables prevented glare. Every brick and joist held purpose. The slight upward warp in Florence's Silk Guild's flooring allowed spilled threads to roll toward collection points, and the copper-lined hearths in Venetian glassmakers' halls reflected heat evenly without scorching precious recipes. What emerges is a continuum from the booming spectacle of mystery plays to the whispered genius of guild architecture, all sharing one medieval conviction that space itself could educate, narrate, and preserve. Whether through a pageant wagon's tiers or a brewer's calibrated cellar, these structures proved that knowledge didn't always need parchment to endure. Sometimes it simply needed stone, wood, and the wisdom to let them speak. Guildhalls stood as stone guardians of trade secrets, their very walls whispering lessons to those who knew how to listen. Step inside the London Goldsmiths' Hall, and the north-facing windows immediately told a story, their angled panes flooding worktables with shadow-free light perfect for spotting impurities in molten metal. The display niches along the walls weren't just for showing finished pieces. Their graduated depths taught apprentices proper proportion at a glance, shallow for rings, deeper for chalices. Even the floor tiles held silent wisdom. Their slightly uneven surface forced craftsmen to stand with balanced posture, while the central hearth's positioning ensured metals cooled at the ideal rate for precise engraving. These buildings functioned as three-dimensional textbooks. In Bruges' Cloth Hall, the massive oak beams overhead bore numbered notches corresponding to specific weaving tensions, a tactile reference library accessible to illiterate and scholar alike. The Butchers' Guilds of Ghent built their meeting halls with marble-lined walls not for opulence, but because the smooth stone could be scrubbed clean of bloodstains, silently enforcing hygiene standards. At the Strasbourg Tanners Guild, the courtyard's circular drainage channel wasn't just practical. Its spiral pattern mimicked the motion of stirring vats, imprinting the proper technique into muscle memory through daily observation. Symbolism permeated every architectural choice. The compass rose inlaid in the floor of Florence's Silk Guild Hall didn't merely decorate. It aligned with hidden ventilation shafts that maintained perfect humidity for delicate threads. In Venice, the Glassmakers' Guild's meeting chamber featured a ceiling painted with celestial maps, reminding artisans that their craft mirrored the divine alchemy of starlight. Even the iron door handles shaped like tools hammers for blacksmiths, shears for tailors served as constant, wordless reminders of guild identity. The true genius lay in how these spaces cultivated mastery through enforced rituals. The staggered workbenches in Antwerp's Painters' Guild forced apprentices to begin each day grinding pigments near the entrance, progressing inward as skills improved, a physical manifestation of artistic growth. In Cologne's Brewers' Hall, the cellar's stone arches were precisely spaced to create natural cooling zones, teaching temperature control through spatial awareness rather than written instructions. When a journeyman finally reached the master's elevated dais at the far end of the hall, he'd absorbed decades of knowledge simply by moving through the architecture's unspoken curriculum. Now follow the guildsman's gaze upward to where another medieval innovation harnessed silent symbolism, the humble dovecote. These seemingly simple towers were feats of avian architecture, their hundreds of nesting niches arranged in precise mathematical patterns. At Canterbury's St. Augustine's Abbey, the circular dovecote's interior spiraled upward like a Fibonacci sequence, each tier's nest size calibrated to the bird's social hierarchy. The thick walls maintained constant temperatures for squabs, while the central rotating pole allowed harvesters to collect eggs without ladder noise disturbing the flock. Dovecotes spoke a silent language of status and sustenance. The octagonal tower at Much Wenlock Priory wasn't just picturesque. Its 8 sides represented resurrection, as doves were Christian symbols of the soul. Noble estates like Bodiam Castle positioned their dovecotes within view of banquet halls, a living larder where the number of nesting pairs visibly demonstrated the Lord's wealth. Even the orientation mattered. Entries always faced southeast to catch morning sun but avoid harsh winds, turning practicality into poetry. What united guildhalls and dovecotes was this medieval mastery of silent communication. Whether through the precise angles of a goldsmith's workstation or the spiraling nests of a pigeon tower, these structures proved that knowledge could reside in stone as surely as in scrolls, waiting only for attentive eyes to decode their enduring lessons. Dovecotes rose like gentle sentinels across the medieval landscape, their rounded towers perforated with hundreds of tiny niches, each a private chamber for the softest of messengers. Far from simple birdhouses, these structures were feats of quiet engineering, designed to amplify tranquility. The thick stone walls of the dovecote at Much Wenlock Priory in England muffled the outside world, creating a sanctuary where the flutter of wings and the murmur of cooing became a living lullaby. Inside, the spiral arrangement of nesting holes wasn't random. It mirrored the Fibonacci sequence, a mathematical hymn to nature's harmony. Every detail whispered intention. The southeastern-facing entrance welcomed morning sun while shielding against harsh winds, and the rotating central pole allowed keepers to harvest eggs without startling the flock, silent stewardship at its finest. These towers spoke a silent language of status. On estates like Bodiam Castle, the dovecote stood prominently within view of the Great Hall, its bustling population of birds a visible tally of the Lord's wealth. Each nesting pair represented more than potential meals. They were living proof of land rights, as only nobility could legally keep doves, creatures notorious for feasting on peasant crops. The very presence of a dovecote declared, without a single written decree, that its owner commanded both resources and privilege. Yet there was poetry in this practicality. The same birds that symbolized power also carried ancient associations with peace, their wings echoing the descent of the Holy Spirit in Christian art. Beyond status, dovecotes embodied self-sufficiency. The birds required no feeding, foraging freely across the countryside, yet always returning to their stone haven. Their guano, collected on trays beneath the nests, became coveted fertilizer, turning the tower into a silent engine of agricultural abundance. In monasteries like Clairvaux Abbey, dovecotes stood near herb gardens, their droppings enriching medicinal plants, a cycle of quiet reciprocity between creature and cultivator. Even the structure's shape held meaning. Round designs dominated colder regions for better heat retention, while square towers in Mediterranean areas maximized shade, each adaptation a wordless dialogue with climate. Now follow the flight of those doves beyond manor walls, toward the bustling network of medieval inns where silence took on a different, equally vital role. Travel in the Middle Ages was a symphony of hoofbeats and footfalls, yet way stations like the Tabard Inn of Chaucer's Tales mastered the art of hushed hospitality. Their architecture catered to weary travelers' unspoken needs. Thick plaster walls swallowed the clatter of the common room, while sleeping chambers clustered around central courtyards muffled nighttime disturbances. The strategic placement of stables close enough for security but downwind for comfort spoke volumes about the silent calculus of guest care. Inns facilitated silent communication through design. The carved symbols on their doors, a lion for reputable lodgings, a crossed keys for pilgrim hostels, required no literacy to understand. Inside, the arrangement of benches in the common room wasn't arbitrary. Curved backs and high sides created pockets of privacy where merchants could negotiate without eavesdroppers. Even the floors told stories. The worn grooves near certain tables revealed preferred spots for clandestine meetings, while the squeaky board left deliberately unrepaired by the stairs served as an informal alarm for the innkeeper. The genius of these spaces lay in their layered silence. Cellars stocked with local ale and bread meant fewer noisy midnight deliveries, while inner courtyards with covered galleries allowed travelers to stretch their legs without braving the clamor of the street. At Canterbury's Chequers Inn, the positioning of the well visible from every guest room let visitors check for safety without questioning the staff. These weren't just places to sleep. They were waypoints in a larger, unspoken contract of trust, where every architectural choice whispered reassurance to strangers far from home. Perhaps the most profound silence occurred in the inn's chapel corner, where a simple candle and wooden cross offered respite without sermonizing. Here, pilgrims of all languages could share wordless communion, their journeys momentarily paused in the flickering light. Like the dovecotes cooing towers, these humble sanctuaries proved that sometimes the deepest messages are carried not by shouts, but by the spaces between them. Inns stood as silent diplomats of the medieval road, neutral ground where pilgrims, merchants, and vagabonds could share space without sharing language. The moment a traveler pushed open the heavy oak door of a well-run inn like Canterbury's Chequers of the Hope, the architecture began its quiet work. Thatch overhead absorbed the drumming of rain, while whitewashed walls reflected candlelight into every corner, eliminating shadowed corners where tensions might fester. The long trestle tables in the common room weren't randomly placed. Their slight outward fan from the hearth created natural conversational pockets while maintaining clear sight lines for the innkeeper's watchful eye. Private chambers revealed even subtler genius. The screen's passage separating sleeping quarters from the hall wasn't just about privacy. Its latticework filtered noise while allowing the scent of baking bread to permeate, tethering strangers to the comfort of home. Upstairs, guest rooms featured beds aligned east-west, not by accident but to catch morning light through narrow windows, gently rousing travelers without abrupt noises. Even the stable yards spoke this silent language. Their cobbles sloped toward central drains to mute hoofbeats, while haylofts positioned over the inn's kitchen harnessed rising heat to dry fodder, a symbiotic efficiency requiring no explanation. What truly set these spaces apart was their mastery of unspoken rules. The iron-bound ale kegs behind the counter weren't just secure. Their standardized sizes assured merchants from Bruges to Barcelona of fair measure. Pilgrim hostels like Santiago's Hospederia embedded scallop shells in their floor tiles, guiding the faithful to wash basins before meals without signage. Inns along the Via Francigena to Rome went further, coloring their doorframes with ochre or charcoal to silently signal which languages the staff might understand, a chromatic code transcending alphabets. The real magic happened in the in-between spaces. Covered galleries known as pentices connected buildings while shielding guests from weather, their overhangs designed at precise angles to block summer sun but welcome winter light. The buttery where ale and candles were stored always stood between kitchen and hall, its placement ensuring servers could replenish without crossing the dining space unnecessarily. Even the hearth smoke management was pedagogical. At Gloucester's New Inn, the fireplace flue widened just enough to draw smoke upward without roaring drafts, teaching by example the balance between warmth and fresh air. These silent strategies extended to conflict prevention. Inns near tournament sites like Ashby de la Zouch built circular staircases, not for elegance but to force armed knights to ascend single file, right hand pinned against the wall, reducing drunken brawls. The notorious thieves' tables in Southwark's coaching inns had subtly tilted surfaces, causing unattended tankards to slide and spill, discouraging theft through inconvenience rather than confrontation. Even the placement of holy water stoups by entrances served dual purposes, blessing travelers while providing a visible pause where weapons could be peace-tied. Now follow the inn's supply chain out back to where another silent revolution unfolded, the medieval barn. These unassuming structures held agricultural wisdom as meticulously catalogued as any monastic library. The tithe barns of Glastonbury Abbey didn't just store grain. Their alternating oak and chestnut beams created natural humidity control, the different woods expanding and contracting at varying rates to regulate airflow. The threshing floors were laid with slightly concave tiles, their angle and texture perfect for separating wheat from chaff with minimal labor, a tactile technology passed down through generations of calloused hands. The real marvel was in the details. Dovecotes integrated into barn gables provided pest control, the birds feasting on insects drawn to stored crops. At Cressing Temple's barley barn, the gaps between vertical boards could be adjusted seasonally with wooden pegs wider in summer for ventilation, tighter in winter to retain warmth. Even the decorative hex signs on Flemish barn doors weren't mere folk art. Their patterns secretly identified the farm's specialty to illiterate neighbors' circles for dairy, stars for grain, diamonds for livestock. What barns and inns shared was this medieval knack for encoding knowledge into wood and stone. Whether through the precise pitch of a barn roof that shed snow effortlessly or the strategic curve of an inn staircase that diffused tensions, these structures proved that sometimes the loudest lessons are the ones never spoken aloud. Barns rose from the countryside like timber cathedrals, their vaulted naves sheltering not congregations, but the quiet labor of harvest. The tithe barns of England's Glastonbury Abbey stretched longer than many churches, their cruck frames curving heavenward like the ribs of some vast wooden whale, each beam hand-hewn to precise angles that distributed weight without nails or bolts. This wasn't just carpentry, it was silent physics, where the interplay of tension and compression turned oak trees into self-supporting ecosystems. Walk inside, and you'd feel the hush settle over you, the thick thatch overhead swallowing rain and wind, the staggered ventilation slats maintaining perfect humidity to preserve grain while deterring rodents. Every element whispered intention. The east-facing doors welcomed morning light for early workers, while the north walls stood windowless to block damp winds that might spoil the harvest. These structures were living almanacs. The spacing between beams often mirrored lunar cycles, allowing just enough airflow to prevent mildew during wet seasons. At Cressing Temple's barley barn, built by the Knights Templar in the 13th century, the floor's slight incline directed spilled grain toward collection points, while the central threshing area's worn planks bore the ghostly grooves of countless flails, a tactile record of communal labor. Even the decorative motifs carved into roof trusses held meaning. Interlocking circles symbolized eternity, while rosettes honored the Virgin Mary as protector of crops. Farmers didn't need written manuals when the barn itself taught them when to store, when to ventilate, and when to gather. The genius of these designs lay in their dualities. Massive yet nimble, they could withstand gales yet flex during storms, their timber joints groaning like living things. Their proportions often followed the golden barn ratio, width to length matching the harmonic intervals of Gregorian chant, though the builders likely called it God's geometry. At the French Grange of Volerant, the barn's alignment caught summer breezes to naturally winnow chaff, while its winter shadows pointed toward storage zones needing extra insulation. This was architecture as timekeeper, its very orientation marking solstices when sunlight pierced specific ventilation slats to illuminate designated work areas. Now step from these rural sanctuaries into the bustling theater of town squares where silence took on a radically different form. If barns were hymns to patience and cycles, market squares were symphonies of controlled chaos. The Grand Place of Brussels didn't need signage to direct traffic. Its radiating cobblestone patterns funneled carts toward the cloth hall while guiding foot traffic past guild stalls. The stepped platforms before Rowan's Butter Market weren't mere stages. Their graduated heights created a natural amphitheater where a crier's voice could cascade over crowds without shouting. Even the iron rings bolted into Exeter's Market Cross served silent governance, spacing vendors precisely to prevent territorial disputes. Light played its part in this unspoken choreography. The staggered roof lines of Ypres cloth halls cast shadows that moved like sundials, marking optimal times for wool inspections when natural light fell brightest on fabric samples. In Siena's Campo, the fan-shaped pavement wasn't just beautiful, its converging lines drew eyes toward the town hall's balcony, where officials could survey transactions without descending into the fray. At night, the placement of torch brackets created pools of illumination around authorized trading zones, while leaving shadowed margins where illicit deals risked exposure. What united barns and squares was this medieval mastery of silent influence, whether through the cathedral-like quiet of a well-tuned granary or the deliberate pandemonium of a market engineered to balance noise and order. Both proved that architecture's most enduring language often lies not in what it declares, but in what it orchestrates without a word. Town squares pulsed with silent choreography, their open spaces conducting human interaction as precisely as a maestro's baton. The Piazza del Campo in Siena didn't need signs to direct its famous palio horse race. The sloping brick pavement naturally funneled riders along its curved perimeter, while the 9 segments of red brick radiating from the town hall's base silently honored the governing council of 9. Market days unfolded with similar architectural guidance. Vendors instinctively positioned themselves where the morning light would best illuminate their wares, their spots dictated not by decree but by centuries of accumulated wisdom written in stone shadows. Central features spoke volumes without words. The market cross present in nearly every European square wasn't merely decorative, its stepped base functioned as a natural stage for proclamations, the height difference between speaker and crowd enforcing order through unspoken hierarchy. Fountains like Brussels' Mankin Piss served practical and symbolic roles simultaneously, their constant flow providing fresh water while the sound masked private conversations from nearby eavesdroppers. Even the pillory's placement held significance. Positioned near but not at the exact center, it balanced public shaming with subtle mercy, allowing the condemned some psychological distance from the heart of community life. Surrounding buildings conspired to shape behavior through silent cues. The overhanging upper stories of guildhalls in places like Bruges created shelter for market stalls, while their shadowed undersides discouraged loitering. Clock towers did more than tell time. Their faces were deliberately positioned to be visible from specific angles, ensuring merchants could check deadlines without leaving their booths. In Prague's Old Town Square, the asymmetrical arrangement of churches and palaces created natural acoustic zones where a speaker at the astronomical clock could be heard clearly in some areas while maintaining pockets of privacy elsewhere. Seasonal transformations revealed the square's hidden versatility. During festivals, temporary structures slotted into pre-existing stone sockets, evidence of which still dots many European plazas, transforming orderly marketplaces into theaters overnight. The same space that hosted weekly cheese vendors might become an open-air passion play stage come Easter, its dimensions carefully calibrated to accommodate both commerce and dramatic spectacle. Winter brought different adaptations. In German towns like Rothenburg, the central square's drainage channels doubled as ice skating rinks, their gentle slopes maintaining perfect water depth when frozen. The real genius lay in how these spaces facilitated both unity and dissent. Revolutions often began at fountains where the water's sound allowed conspiracy to flourish, while loyalist rallies gathered near symbols of authority like equestrian statues. A single square could host a royal procession in the morning and a bread riot by afternoon, its architecture remaining neutral while its function changed with the crowd's will. The subtle camber of Florence's Piazza della Signoria, barely noticeable underfoot, ensured rainwater, and by extension protesters' debris would drain efficiently away from government buildings. Now follow the flow of that drainage toward the edges of town, where another silent sentinel stood guard, the city gate. More than mere openings in walls, these structures were sophisticated filters, their architecture carefully calibrated to welcome allies while deterring threats without constant supervision. The staggered entrance of York's Micklegate Bar forced approaching visitors into a zigzag path, eliminating any chance of charging through at speed. Above, murder holes in the vaulted ceiling threatened invisible consequences, their shadows crossing the threshold like the fingers of a restraining hand. Portcullises hung with silent menace, their iron teeth poised to descend at the first sign of trouble, a wordless reminder that passage was privilege, not right. Gatehouses mastered the psychology of controlled access. Their towers often held chambers where visitors could be observed unseen, the arrow-slit windows providing one-way visibility. The thickness of doors, like the 20-inch oak of London's Newgate, communicated civic strength through sheer mass, while the intricate carvings around the archways signaled cultural sophistication to arriving merchants. Even the gate's daily opening and closing became ritual theater, the slow grind of winches and creak of hinges marking temporal boundaries as clearly as physical ones, their sounds carrying across surrounding neighborhoods to regulate collective schedules. What made these gates truly remarkable was their dual nature as both barrier and bridge. By day, they functioned as customs houses and information centers, their architecture facilitating exchange, the alcoves where toll collectors sat positioned to see approaching travelers long before reaching the walls. By night, their massive locks and chain drawbridges transformed them into impenetrable seals. The gates of medieval Carcassonne took this further, incorporating false doors and hidden sally ports that only locals could navigate, a silent test of belonging written in stone and timber. Between gate and square, medieval urban design achieved something modern planners still strive for: spaces that guided complex human interaction through intuitive design rather than rigid regulation. Whether through the gentle slope of a marketplace or the intimidating bulk of a barred entrance, these silent architects understood that true order rarely needs to shout. Their lessons linger in our own cities today, if we know how to read the stones beneath our feet. City gates stood as stone sentinels of belonging, their massive frames marking the threshold between stranger and citizen. The moment a traveler approached York's Micklegate Bar, the architecture began its silent interrogation, the narrowed approach forcing a zigzag path that eliminated any chance of charging through, the murder holes overhead hinting at unseen watchers, the heraldic carvings on the archway demanding acknowledgement of the city's authority. These weren't just doors in a wall, they were checkpoints of identity, engineering human movement with the precision of a locksmith's tumbler. Passing through a gate was a ritual written in stone. The staggered entryways of Constantinople's Golden Gate forced visitors to navigate a series of right-angle turns, each shift in direction symbolizing a step deeper into the empire's embrace. In Carcassonne, the outer gate's iron-studded timbers bore scars from centuries of sieges, visible reminders that entry was earned, not given. Even the act of waiting at a raised drawbridge carried meaning. The time spent watching the winch operator's deliberate movements was a silent lesson in patience and submission to civic order. The genius of these structures lay in their layered communication. A merchant from Genoa might not speak German, but he understood Nuremberg's Tiergartner gate at a glance, its twin towers mirroring the city's imperial insignia, the statues of saints in the archway signaling divine oversight of commerce. Guards didn't need to announce inspection rules. The width of the search alcoves dictated how carts must stop, while the height of the toll booth window forced even nobles to look upward when paying fees. Every element conspired to whisper the same truth. Here, the city's laws outweighed personal status. Now, follow the shadows cast by those towering gates to where another silent revolution turned, the mills that harnessed nature's invisible forces. Unlike gates which filtered human traffic, mills orchestrated water and wind into tireless labor. The Cistercian monks of Clairvaux Abbey didn't just build mills along their streams, they engineered them as hydrological symphonies. Each sluice gate and mill race was calibrated to maintain perfect flow, not a drop wasted, not a stone's placement left to chance. The rhythmic thrum of grinding stones became the heartbeat of monastic industry, their steady percussion measuring time more reliably than any hourglass. These weren't crude machines but precision instruments. At the royal mill of Fécamp, the waterwheel's paddles were shaped like curved swords, their scimitar profiles slicing through currents with minimal splash and maximum efficiency. The grain hoppers above the millstones featured spiral grooves that fed wheat at the ideal speed too fast, and the flour overheated, too slow, and productivity suffered. Even the wooden gears were lubricated with a silent alchemy of beeswax and rosemary oil, reducing friction without the stench of animal fat. What mills shared with city gates was this medieval mastery of indirect control. Just as gates shaped behavior through architecture rather than brute force, mills coaxed productivity from nature through geometry and patience. The windmill's vanes didn't fight the breeze, they angled to capture its whispers, translating capricious gusts into steady rotation. In both cases, the real genius lay in knowing when to yield, whether to a merchant's need for entry or a river's seasonal moods, and when to stand immovable as stone. Mills stood as quiet titans in the medieval landscape, their sails and waterwheels turning ceaselessly without the clamor we associate with industry today. The rhythmic creak of a windmill's vanes or the steady rush of a mill race became the soundtrack of progress, so subtle they blended into nature's own whispers. At the Abbey of Fontenay, Cistercian monks engineered their watermills with such precision, that the only sound was the occasional drip of overflow channels, a far cry from modern machinery's roar. This wasn't just efficiency, it was reverence, as if the builders understood that harnessing nature's power demanded harmony rather than domination. The silent genius of these structures lay in their dual roles as both tools and teachers. A single mill could grind grain, full cloth, and forge iron with nothing more than redirected streams and clever gear ratios. The horizontal water wheels of Norse mills, submerged directly in fast-flowing streams, needed no noisy gears. Their paddles turned millstones through sheer hydraulic force, a lesson in minimalist engineering. Meanwhile, the post mills of England's Downs rotated entire structures to face changing winds, their oak frames groaning softly like old ships adjusting their course. Every design choice whispered a truth, that technology needn't shout to transform lives. Beyond mechanics, mills became communal compasses. Their placement along rivers or hilltops silently mapped regional economies. The closer a village stood to a mill, the higher its status. The circular stone towers of Mediterranean windmills weren't just functional. Their whitewashed curves mirrored local chapels, blending spiritual and earthly sustenance into a single skyline. In Flanders, the alignment of mill sails conveyed messages. Slightly tilted blades indicated the miller was away, while a crossed position signaled mourning, turning industry into a visual language. Aesthetic harmony elevated mills beyond mere utility. The thatched roofs of Dutch smock mills softened their angular frames, while the intricate brick patterns of Spanish haciendas turned water wheels into kinetic sculptures. At the Royal Mill of Fécamp, the scalloped edges of the millpond doubled as a reflecting pool, catching sunlight to illuminate the grinding room below. This wasn't vanity. It reflected a philosophy where beauty and function shared equal weight, where even the humblest flour mill could uplift the spirit as it nourished the body. The legacy of these silent engines endures in unexpected ways. Modern wind turbines owe their swept wing designs to medieval millwrights who first understood aerodynamics through trial and error. The quiet efficiency of water-powered mills inspired contemporary hydroelectric plants, proving that ancient solutions often outlast the civilizations that birthed them. Perhaps most profoundly, these structures remind us that progress doesn't require disruption, that the most enduring innovations often work in concert with nature's own rhythms, leaving behind not noise but the quiet hum of possibility. As our journey through these silent sanctuaries comes to a close, we're left with a profound realization. The medieval world understood something we've nearly forgotten. True preservation doesn't always require loud proclamations or written manifestos. Sometimes the most enduring messages are etched in the curve of a cloister's archway, the play of light through stained glass, or the precise angle of a scribe's desk. These structures weren't just buildings, they were conversations stretched across centuries, inviting us to listen with more than our ears. Think about the last time you stepped into an old library or walked down a cobbled street where the stones seemed to hum with history. That feeling of connection isn't accidental. It's the culmination of generations who encoded their wisdom into materials meant to outlast them. The Benedictine monks who designed scriptoria to protect fragile manuscripts, the masons who aligned cathedrals with solstice sunbeams, the guilds who built market halls to orchestrate commerce without chaos, they all shared a quiet faith that architecture could speak when words faded. What's remarkable is how urgently their silent language speaks to us today. In a world drowning in notifications and noise, these medieval spaces offer an antidote, the radical notion that meaning can flourish in stillness. The next time you pass an old stone wall or sit in a centuries-old courtyard, try this pause. Let the geometry of the space work on you. Notice how the light falls at different hours, how the acoustics change your voice, how the proportions of the room affect your posture. You're not just observing history, you're participating in an ancient dialogue about how shape and space shape the human experience. This isn't about nostalgia for a simpler time. It's about reclaiming a lost skill, reading our surroundings as carefully as we scan screens. Those medieval builders left us more than beautiful ruins. They left an invitation to pay attention differently. When we protect these spaces today, we're not just saving stones and mortar. We're safeguarding a way of knowing that values contemplation over consumption, that measures progress not in decibels but in depth. So let's carry this lesson beyond historic sites. What would it mean to design our modern lives with this kind of intentional silence? Perhaps it's a reading nook positioned to catch the morning light, or a workplace that values focus over constant collaboration. Maybe it's simply learning to see the quiet wisdom in the spaces we already inhabit. The way a well-placed window can frame the sky like a living painting, or how an uncluttered room leaves room for thought to breathe. The medieval world whispered its secrets to those willing to lean close. Now it's our turn to listen and to build our own legacies that don't just shout into the void, but speak across time with the eloquence of thoughtful design. Share in the comments below, where have you encountered spaces that spoke without words? Your story might just help someone else hear the silence anew.